I think he goes down certainly as one of the greatest managers of all time, and I also think that without him, we may not have had the level of success that pro wrestling is today because of his contributions to not only the business but specifically ECW. And I think that's where I'm going to start here, talking about ECW, because ECW, Extreme Championship Wrestling, was such a monumental and influential organization that it's still felt to this day. I mean, we just saw a couple weeks ago an entire episode of NXT dedicated to ECW airing from the ECW arena. Obviously, it was known as Eastern Championship Wrestling, but by the time that Paul Heyman got there and got his hands on the booking and the company itself, it would transition to Extreme Championship Wrestling. And the idea was, for Paul Heyman and company, that it would be an alternative to the alternative. You see, mainstream audiences of professional wrestling, they had WWF, they had WCW, and at this time there wasn't a lot of prominent indie promotions or prominent third, tertiary type of level companies. But this was an opportunity for Paul Heyman to stick out. One thing that WWE and WCW had in its pocket was money. They had a great financial stability in their cases. They had tremendous TV rights, TV production, backings by millionaires and billionaires and stockholders alike. ECW was that renegade promotion that really stood the test of time because of its ability to connect with fans on a broader sense. Where WWE and WCW at that time, of course, was a little bit PC friendly and they followed the rules and norms that was sports entertainment. ECW wasn't afraid to color outside of the lines. ECW was one of the first promotions to introduce realism and real storylines on its show. There was a lot of action, there was a lot of drama. Some people thought the blood might have been grotesque, but it was certainly something that attracted young audience members as well as diehard fans to keep coming back. You saw big promotions in ECW that led to the stars that we know today. Guys like Rob Van Dam, the Dudley Boys, Sabu, Tommy Dreamer, Raven, so many other individuals that come to mind. And it's all in large part due to their contributions, but you have to give a tip of the hat to Paul Heyman, who was the leader of this self-proclaimed revolution. Another thing that ECW stood out to was its use of licensed music. One of the obvious references would be Sandman, who entered to Metallica's Enter the Sandman, really blending the two of modern music with professional wrestling, specifically when it came to the rock scene. A lot of people associate that genre of music with pro wrestling. It reminds us of the golden years of the Attitude Era in the 90s and the early 2000s. ECW had a large part in introducing the two audiences to one another. ECW, as I talked about, was a renegade promotion because it wasn't afraid to tackle barriers and it wasn't afraid to step outside of the norm. And I think that's one thing that WWE and WCW took note of. WCW, who was the main competitor to the WWF at that time, they wanted to do something different. They wanted to be an alternative to the WWE. So what did they do? They went realism. They wanted real storylines that blended reality and fiction. The New World Order, the NWO, was one of those first instances where fans were questioning whether or not this was a shoot or was it a work. And in large part, you can look at ECW for doing things like that, for being able to blend reality and fiction. It was not only their realism in their storylines, but the action itself, where we saw more hardcore wrestling that would influence decisions like WWE going for the Attitude Era. ECW was recognized for its, car crash TV, meaning that it was all go and little stops. There was always something going on. It was always transitioning to another story, whether it was shock value, whether it was technical prowess, or whether it was just a means of connecting with the audience on different levels. The Attitude Era was significant in doing that. When you had guys like Stone Cold Steve Austin flipping off the boss, D-Generation X with their vulgar speech, it was in large part due to what ECW had done. And ECW and Paul Heyman managed to create a partnership with the WWE. I mean, you look at the 97 year where they were going to have their first pay-per-view barely legal. It introduced audiences to ECW, large audiences. Obviously, the Philadelphia and New York scene were familiar with the Extreme Championship Wrestling promotion, but on a large scheme, maybe not a lot of people knew them. So it was a great opportunity for exposure for ECW. Not only was it a great partnership for ECW, but for WWE as well, because it's shown that they were willing to grow and help out another promotion. Rather, not maybe not help out, but acknowledge that times were changing, and they were willing to work with that. The ultimate enemy was the WCW, but ECW was really that third tier promotion, like I talked about, because they had really introduced so many, talent, guys like Eddie Guerrero, Rey Mysterio, Psychosis. These were guys that got their start in ECW. Other guys who were able to rehabilitate their careers. Look at a guy like Stone Cold Steve Austin, who had left WCW. Rather, he was fired by WCW and was stunning Steve Austin, one half of the Hollywood Blondes. And in time, between his WCW exit and his arrival in the WWF, he spent a short time in the ECW arena. And this is where he really got to hone in on who Stone Cold Steve Austin would become. This is where he regained that confidence and this new presentation of what Stunning Steve turned into Stone Cold Steve Austin. ECW was a great market not only for the diehard fans, but for fans like you and I who just wanted something different. We saw in WWF around this time, it was like The Undertaker versus Psycho Sid, two behemoths, two giants competing for the top prize in that promotion. At that same time, WCW had the New World Order, an ever-growing organization built to destroy World Championship Wrestling, where a babyface like Sting was tasked with bringing them down. But then if you wanted something different, something a little bit more grunge, if you will, you go to ECW, and they had these hardcore matches, these lucha libre style matches, technical matches that involved Dean Malenko and Eddie Guerrero. You also had the iconic rivalry between Raven and Tommy Dreamer that really dove into the psychology and the backstories, the origins of these characters as they were friends, growing up as children, and then their feud over Beulah McGillicuddy until becoming adults in the ECW arena. It was long-term storytelling. It became an access for us to have a new world of wrestling. And Paul Heyman was really the focal point. Now, I talk about all these great things about ECW, and I do think it's important to recognize that it was not always sunshine and rainbows down in the land of extreme, because Paul Heyman and ECW, as I mentioned, lacked the one thing that his competition had, and that was financial backings. These guys were struggling to stay afloat when it came to money. They were losing money, they were losing viewerships, and because of this extreme nature of their product, they would lose sponsors, they would lose deals, because it wasn't something that mainstream really wanted to produce. You can look at guys like New Jack and the whole mass transit incident. You can look at all the injuries and the controversies that came out of ECW. A lot of good, but a fair share of bad as well. This is what led to them closing up shop in 2000 and ultimately getting bought out due to bankruptcy in 2001, where WWF would purchase them.